in the previous exercise, we had already configured our Firebase backend as a service with the new project and also set up a lot of the data into our database and then set up our storage and configured our Firebase server to act as the backend for our Angular application. In this exercise, we're going to look at a modified version of our Angular application, which makes use of the Firebase backend as a service in order to obtain the data and also store information for users on the servers. Also, we will take advantage of the authentication support that Firebase provides to authenticate users, both using an email and password approach and also using a Google account. To get started on this exercise, go to a convenient location on your computer and then clone the given Git repository where I have provided you with the Angular Firebase version of our Angular application. So type git clone https github.com/j-mupala/confusion-angular6-firebase.git and then clone the Git repository. And once the Git repository is cloned to your computer, then move into the Confusion Angular Firebase folder that will get created at this point, and then you would notice that a bunch of files are already installed there. Let's go ahead and do an npm install to install all the node modules on which this Angular application is dependent upon. This version will also install two additional node modules called Firebase and then Angular Fire 2. I will explain a bit more about these two node modules later on in this exercise. Once the project installation is complete, open the project in an editor and then in the project go into the source environments folder and then open environment.ts file. And in the environment.ts file, you will see a set of Firebase configuration that you need to set up with your own Firebase server configuration. As we have seen in the previous exercise, we can obtain all this information when we click on this button here called Add Firebase to your web app, and then copy this information and then paste this information into your environment.ts file to replace these with your specific Firebase server's configuration for all this piece of information. And once that is completed, then you can start up your Angular application by typing ng-serve at the prompt. Once your Angular application is compiled with ng-serve, then go to a browser and then type localhost 4200 to load in your Angular application. And you will notice that your Angular application is compiled and then loaded into your browser just like before. So once your Angular application is up and running, you will notice that this version of the Angular application is going to be making use of the Firebase server that you have set up in the previous exercise. And so here you would see the home page, the about page as we see here, and the menu and the contact page. And obviously, since we are not currently logged in, the My Favorites page will display an error saying no user is logged in. So let's log in ourselves. Let me go back to the home page and then we'll log in ourselves. So when you click on the login button, you will see the typical form here with the email and the password information. You will also see an additional button here called Login with Google. So let me log in with my Google account. So when you click on the Login with Google, then it will open another browser window where you will be asked to authorize for using your Google account by this Firebase server. So let me go ahead and authorize this application. And then once the authorization is completed, then you will see that your Firebase based Angular application will start up. And on the right-hand corner, you will immediately see your name being displayed here, and with the login button now turned into a logout button. So at this point, you should be able to see your favorites. And in this case, since we don't have any favorites, so it'll be empty at this point. Let me go back to the menu and then add a couple of items into my favorites. So I'll add this dish to my favorites. So when I click on this dish, you will immediately see the icon turn into a filled heart. And let me also select one more dish and add it into my favorites. And then now when you go to the my favorites, you will see the couple of dishes added into your favorites, as you would expect. And again, you can delete the dishes by clicking on the delete toggle up here, and then click on the cross to remove the item from your list of favorites, as shown here. Now, we can also add, as you realize, we can go to any dish and then add comments about the dish. So let me add in a comment here. And the moment you submit the comment, you will immediately see that your comment will be displayed here with the author's, the comment author's name also included in here, and with the date as shown here. So you can see that the user's submission of comments will be supported for any specific dish. Let me add in one more favorite, and so this user will have a couple of favorites. Let me log out this user, go back to the home page, and then log out this user. Now we will log in using the other account. So I had set up this email password account earlier, and so we will log in as this other user. And once the other user is logged in, let me again go to the menu and add a couple of items into the favorites for this particular user. And so when you go back to my favorites, you will see these items listed for the second user. Now, similarly, for this user, let me again submit another comment by this user. So and you would see that the comment submitted by the second user is also added into the application. So this is how your Angular application works with the Firebase as the backend as a service. Now, of course, you must be wondering, how do we redesign our Angular application to make use of Firebase instead of using the standard Express plus MongoDB server that we have built earlier? In order to configure your Angular application to communicate with the Firebase server, there are two node modules that you need to install into your Angular application. And one of them is the Firebase module. The Firebase module, as you see here, provides the tool and infrastructure that enables you to communicate with the Firebase server. And to install this into your application, you type npm install -- save Firebase. Now, along with this, there is another module called the Angular Fire 2. So the Angular Fire 2 also, again, I have provided the links to these two modules in the additional resources. The Angular Fire 2 is the official library for Firebase and Angular support. And as you can see, it's an observable-based support for Angular Fire. So this works to add to the Firebase npm module and then gives you a observable-based interface that we can use in your Angular application. So we would be leveraging the Angular Fire 2. So to make use of Angular Fire 2, you need to install both Firebase as well as Angular Fire 2. So in one shot, install both these into your Angular application. Now, the version of the Angular application that I have provided for you automatically installs both these as you will see when you examine the package.json file. Now, how to make use of these two? I will illustrate that by quickly running you through the modified code for the services and a couple of components where we make use of Firebase and Angular Fire 2 to modify the Angular application that we have developed earlier to make use of the Firebase server as the backend as a service. In order to understand more about how we leverage Firebase and Angular Fire 2 within our Angular application, our first stop is at the package.json file. So in the package.json file, you will notice that I have installed Angular Fire 2 here, and also we have installed Firebase to use in this version of the Angular application that I supply for you. So note that these two will automatically be installed when you type npm install after cloning this Git repository that I have provided for you. If you were starting with a new Angular application, then you should be installing both Angular Fire 2 as well as Firebase in order to leverage the use of Firebase as the backend as a service. Now, having installed these two, let's learn how we make use of these within our services. So the best way to learn how to make use of both of these is to visit some of the services that we have configured in our application and understand how we leverage the use of Angular Fire 2 and Firebase. So we'll start with dishservice.ts file. So if you go to dishservice.ts file, you will notice that here in this dish service, you will see me importing this Angular Firestore, Angular Firestore document, and Angular Firestore collection from Angular Fire 2 Firestore here. So that brings in whatever I need from my Angular Firestore npm module. Also, you will notice that I am importing everything from Firebase/app as Firebase into my dish service here. So once we have imported these two, let's take a quick look at how we reconfigure our dish service here. So if you go into the dish service, you will notice that I am no longer using HTTP client. Instead, I am injecting AFS, which is the Angular Firestore, into the constructor here. The Angular Firestore is the one that gives me access to the Firebase backend as a service. Now, also recall that we have already configured all the details of our server and also the Firestore project in the environment.ts file earlier. So you should have configured this information already there on how your Angular application should be leveraging your Firestore based project on your Firestore server to access the data that you have configured there. So this will give me access to my Cloud Firestore within my Firebase project that I have set up. Now, the auth service is of course the same auth service that we have used before, but it has modified to make use of Angular support for Firebase. We'll visit the auth service to learn how it has been updated. Now, the auth service will give us access to this method called getAuthState, which will return in an observable. This observable, when we subscribe to it, will give us the information as a user, which contains the user's information. So I will obtain that and then set up the current user in my application as the user returned by this observable here. So when we visit auth service, we will learn what this getAuthState will return for us. And so the current user's information can be obtained from any of the other services because we are already injecting auth service in here. Now let's take a look at how getDishes method is implemented here. Now earlier in the getDishes method, we were using the HTTP client to access the server at base URL +/dishes. Now in this case, to access a collection in my Firebase, server, we'll say this dot AFS. So this is what Angular Fire 2 provides for us. AFS, as you see, is the Angular Firestore that we have injected here. And so we say this.afs.collection. And here we will specify the specific collection that we are accessing here. Recall that we had set up the dishes, the promotions, and the leaders collections on my Firebase server. So this directly gives me access to my dishes collection here. And from the dishes collection, I can either do dot value changes, which will return all the information in the dishes collection for me, or I can do dot snapshot changes, which will return additional information, including the ID of the dishes. So if I, instead of doing snapshot changes, if I say value changes, it will return only the dish information, but it will not return the IDs of the dishes. But since I will need the IDs of my dishes, so that's why I'm using the dot snapshot changes in this case. So when dot snapshot changes is called, this will return, as you see, an observable, which I map. And so the return value, which is called as actions. And this actions, again, will be an observable, which I will map each action in this actions, and then extract the data from the action that is returned here. So the action is a value that is returned for each of the actions, and this action contains a payload and contains inside that a doc field here. Now this is something that I have figured out by reading the documentation for Angular Fire 2. And so when we call this data function on this action payload doc, this will give me the data for that specific dish that is obtained from my dishes collection on the server side. So each document in there will be returned here. And then I obtain the ID for that by saying action payload doc ID. So that's where the ID of that will be carried. And then I will join the two together and return this as a dish document back to my various components from where I will call this getDishes method. So as you recall, from the menu component, I'm calling the getDishes method in order to obtain the information about all the dishes in my collection. So each of these dish that is returned as a doc will be reconstructed into a JavaScript object with the ID inserted here, and also the data that is extracted from this action payload doc.data. Now, this is something that you learn by reading the documentation of Angular Fire 2. Now, since I have already done that part, I am showing you the exact code that you are supposed to use in order to extract the data and then supply this data back to your component that is going to call the getDishes method here. So by doing this for each one of the documents there, this document will be reconstructed into the dish document that we dish object that we use in our Angular application. And so we are able to even get access to the ID. If you just do value changes, it will simply return the document information, all the documents themselves, but without the IDs of the documents. So this additional work needs to be done within your service in order to return the information in the right way so that my components can make use of this information. Similarly, for a getDish method, so notice how I am accessing the information for a specific dish. Again, we'll say this.afs, and then you notice that I am saying .doc. And then in here for the .doc method, I supply dishes / and then the ID of the specific dish. Now, the reason why I supply the ID here is coming in as the parameter for the getDish method here. Now, in order for this ID to be supplied, I need to be able to supply that ID in the getDishes method. So when my menu is constructed, every dish will have its ID attached to it there. That ID is passed in here, and so I will be accessing the document at this point. So the Angular Fire 2 allows you to access a specific document which is inside a collection by saying the collection name / plus the document ID. Or you can say this.afs.collection dishes, just like you did here, collection dishes, and then .doc, and then supply doc and ID inside brackets there. So that's another way of addressing a specific dish. Again, I am subscribing to snapshot changes, and this will return an action, which is then mapped again in the same format to construct the dish object here together with the ID here. Now, Firebase keeps the ID separate from the document itself, and so that's why I have to explicitly do this reconstruction in order to obtain the dish document in a way that is usable by my components. Now, when I constructed my own server using Express and MongoDB, the ID automatically was there in the document itself, and so it was very easy to retrieve that and supply it back to the client side. Now, for the get featured dish, recall that for the get featured dish, we are looking for those dishes where the feature is set to true. Now, this is where the Angular Fire 2 allows us to construct a query and supply that query here for that collection. So here I'm saying this AFS collection dishes here. So I'm still using the collection, but then look at the second parameter for this call here. This says ref, where the ref refers to each document that is in this collection. This ref says the ref, and this is where I can use this query setup here. So which says .where. So meaning that each one of the documents where the featured, as you can see, the syntax is fairly easy to follow here, which says where featured. Now notice that featured is supplied as a string here, and then the next one, the operator is equal to. So you can even say greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, any one of these things. But notice that that should be inside quotations here, and then you will say true. So wherever the featured property of the document is set to true, extract all of those. So this query will extract only those documents from the dishes collection where featured is set to true, and then return only those documents from that collection here. And from there, I'm doing snapshot changes, and this will return an array of documents. Now, and from there, I will map them into individual dish documents. And then since I have ensured that only one of those dish documents will have the featured set to true, so it will return only one of them, but it will return it as an array. So that's why I am constructing this with square bracket 0, the first element of that array. And indeed, it will contain only one element, because only one element in my collection will match this particular query that I have set up here with the where here. There are other query setups here. You can also use something called order by, so you can order the collection by a certain property, and some other set of querying options that are available. Now, this is supported by Firebase on its Cloud Firestore, and that is what you can leverage using Angular Fire 2 to design the code on your in your Angular application to do the query from the client side itself. So this is going to return the specific featured dish here. Now again, get dish ID is going to be similar to what we have done earlier, so no modification there. Now for the post comment. So for the post comment, again, because Firebase with the Cloud Firestore beta doesn't have the concept of population and so on that we have seen earlier. So what I'm going to do for the comments is that I'm going to post these comments as a collection for which is enclosed inside each dish itself. So each dish will have its own collection of comments about that specific dish. When I post the comment, I'm going to use the dish ID and then the comment information. So what I do here is that I'm going to first query the dishes and then obtain that particular dish. So you can see that I'm using the other way of querying for a specific document. So here I'm saying this AFS collection dishes doc dish ID. So I can use this way of accessing a specific document if I want to. The other way, of course, you have seen already with the get dish method where I say doc dishes slash plus ID. So two different ways of addressing a specific document inside a collection here. And then dish ID and then collection and comment. So this way it's saying in this collection for the specific document with that dish ID, there is a collection that is included in this document, and that collection has the name comment. So this is a nesting of a collection inside a document which is in another higher level collection. So this kind of nesting of collections is allowed by Firebase Cloud Store Beta up to 100 levels deep if you so wish to choose. So inside this collection, I'm going to add. So how do you add a document to a collection? To add a document to a collection, you use the add method on a collection here. So you can see that on the collection comments, I am doing an add here. And then this is the actual document that is going to be added in here. So in the document itself, you see that I have the author property here, where I have set up the current ID, and also I set up the first name for the author here. I only set up the first name here. So here I say this current user display name. If the display name is true, then I will set it to this current user display name. If the user's account doesn't have a display name attached to it, then I will simply use this current user email as the first name property here. So this document which contains the comment automatically also carries this first name field, and that is what I'm going to be using to render the information when I render the comments in my dish detail component there. So notice that I am actually duplicating information here in each of the comments, but that's okay. Since these are stored as JSON documents on Firebase, it's okay to duplicate some of the information in the comments here. But if you want further details of the current user, you already have a reference to the user's ID here, so you can actually go and fetch the document for the particular user and then obtain further information of the user should you choose to. Now, when I used MongoDB plus Mongoose, you saw that I would just use the current user's ID for the author, and then I would use the populate to populate this information. Now, Cloud Firestore Beta at this moment doesn't have any concept of this populate as far as I can see from the documentation. Maybe a future version might support a way of pulling in information from another document and automatically populating it into the current document. When that happens, then this code will have to be modified to take advantage of that. But right now, as I see it, Firestore Beta doesn't have the ability to populate information from another document into the current document. So that's why I'm just replicating only that piece of information that I really need when I render the comment in my dish detail component here. And then down below here, you can see that I have the rating and the comment here. And then also notice that I am creating these two additional fields in my comment here called created at and updated at. Notice how I am putting the timestamp for the created at. The Firebase. Now, what is this Firebase I'm using here? This Firebase is exactly what I imported here as from Firebase app. So that provides me, as you see here down below here, that provides me with this saying Firestore field value. So this call to the Firestore field value server timestamp will return the current timestamp for me, and that is the information that I'm going to be storing in the created at. Now, when I inserted all the documents here, you saw that I manually created this created at field for each of the documents. Now, this is a way of doing the same from within our Angular code in our client side. And it's the same thing for the updated at field that you see here. So when you post the new comment, you see that this is how you will add a new comment into the server. Now this returns a promise, and so that is the information that I'm using here to construct this promise here. And then this other method here saying get comments. This get comments, as you can see, it is accessing AFS collection dishes, doc, dish ID, and then collection comments. And then notice that here I am not going to be requiring each comment's ID itself, which I will not be using in my Angular application anyway. So instead of using snapshot changes, I'm just using value changes, and this will return all the documents in this comments collection for this particular document, the dish ID from the dish collection here, and that will be returned. And these comments I will be rendering in my dish detail component. Now in Mongoose, you saw that the fact that I included the user ID means that I could do populating of this information. Now with Firebase, there is no way of populating the comment information here. So that is why I am explicitly going and then populating the comments into my dish detail, in my dish detail component, to fetch all the comments about this particular dish when I render them in the dish detail component. So you see that I had to adjust the Angular code a little bit in order to deal with the fact that Firebase doesn't support certain things that Mongoose supports. At least at the moment, Cloud Firestore Beta doesn't support these things. And so I had to work around to deal with what Firebase allows me to store and retrieve from the Firebase server side. Now, it is also interesting for us to pay a quick visit to the auth service here. The auth service here, again, notice that in the auth service here, I am importing this Angular Fire auth from the Angular Fire 2 NPM modules auth submodule here. So here you can see that I'm importing Angular Fire auth, and this gives me access to the authentication aspect of Firebase. Now, let's see how Firebase authentication actually works from our Angular application. Now, we will start that by looking at how login is implemented. So this is where I implement the login, where I am using the email and the password. So this part, when I import the Angular Fire auth here, notice that in the constructor, I am injecting the Angular Fire auth into my constructor. So this will inject the Angular Fire auth service into my constructor, and this gives me access to the Firebase authentication on the server side so that I can authenticate users. So if I want to authenticate a user who is signing in with the email and the password, this login function is the one that is going to be called when I type in my email and password in the login dialog that I pop up and then click on the submit or the login button here. This login function is going to be called, and the user information that I retrieve from the login component is passed in here. So when it comes here, I'm going to use this AF auth, as you see, I just injected it into the constructor, and this supplies this auth object here, which supplies this method called sign in with email and password. So this sign in with email and password takes two parameters here, as you would expect, the user's username or the email and the password here. And so these two piece of information, I'm supplying it as the two parameters to the sign in with email and password. So when you click on that, you see that it says the first one should be email and the second one should be password. Now, the way I have set it up, this user object that is coming in contains the email in the user.username here and the password in the password property of the user object. So when that is obtained, then I will post this information, and then so when this is completed successfully, that means that the user is logged in properly. If there is an error, then you catch the error here. Right now, I am not doing anything specifically with the error. You may wish to print out this error message to indicate that the user cannot log in and so on. So I haven't implemented that part of the deal here. I'm just leaving it right there. If you want to console log this information, you can do that when errors occur. Now for sign out, in Firebase, again, we take the help of the AF auth, which we have injected, and the auth on it. And this provides this method called sign out, which when called will sign out the currently logged in user. And so that is one way of handling this. Now you must be wondering how I handle the Google login part. Now this is also handled with the AF auth. So the Angular Fire 2 module that I'm using supplies this information for this methods for us through the Firebase module, which is also used in Angular Fire 2. And so this supplies this method called sign in with popup. And when we do sign in with popup, here notice what I am specifying here. So I'm saying new firebase.auth.google auth provider. Now you can also do firebase.auth.facebook auth provider and other ones. So as you saw from the previous exercise, Firebase allows you to do third-party login using either Google, Facebook, GitHub, and Twitter. So you can configure these appropriately. Since I have turned on only Google authorization, so this is how I will set it up to use my Google authorization here. And this single line of code that I enclose here is the one that causes the pop-up of the browser, which suggests to me to authorize my Firebase to use Google authorization using my Google account here. So that's the second part that I've set up here. So notice that the auth service has significantly simplified compared to what we did with the previous version of this application. So you can compare the two versions to see how this is different from the other one. Now, not only that, this AF auth that we have injected here, Angular Fire auth part that we have injected here, also provides this observable called auth state. This auth state observable can be subscribed to, and this auth state observable, as you see here, which I have declared here as an observable of the type firebase.user. So that is the information that is going to be supplied here. And also we can I've set up another variable here called current user, which is of the type Firebase user here. So this AF auth state is an observable which I can subscribe to, and whenever this auth state changes, the auth state keeps track of the authentication state of the user, whether the user is logged in or logged out. And if the user is logged in, then this will, when subscribed, will return me the user information. And from the user information, we can retrieve a lot of information, including the display name, the email, the profile ID, and then the avatar image for the user if it has been set up for the specific accounts. All these will be supplied to us automatically by the user. So when you click on user and then dot, you will see that it provides all this information for us. So it says display name, email, whether the email is verified or not, and so on. So some of the things that are of specific interest to us. Photo URL, which can be used to retrieve the avatar information for the user. Provider ID, which specifies who is providing this information for you. This would be either Facebook ID, Google ID, and GitHub ID, and so on. And additional information, even the refresh token. So you see a bunch of information being made available to you through the user object that is returned by this auth state when you subscribe to it. And also, let me draw your attention to the UID, the user ID, and this is what can be used to index the user in our application. So that is the authentication service, the way I have set it up to use Firebase authentication in this application. So two changes that I have reflected to you to show how my services are modified to use Firebase. Much of the updates that I have done to my Angular application are all in the services in order to make use of Firebase install. So because of the way we structured our Angular application, the components were simply depending on the services, and the services were the ones that were talking to the backend. So much of the updates that I have done to my Angular application involve just updating these services to use Google's Firebase backend as a service with the two NPM modules, Firebase and Angular Fire Auth here. And so you would see that much of the updates is restricted to all these services that I have in the services folder of my Angular application. Of course, I needed to do a little bit of minimal adjustments into the dish detail component and the header component in order to make it work with Firebase. You can pay a quick visit to the header component.ts, the header component.html, and the dish detail component.ts file to see how the code has changed between the previous version and the current version of the Angular application. The previous version, I mean the version that we used for communicating with our X++ MongoDB server, which we used in the previous exercise. Now, one more place where you would see me making modifications, interestingly, is in the favorite service. In the favorite service, the way I store the favorites for the user is that the favorites is a collection on my server side, and the favorite itself contains documents. Each document contains the user ID and the dish ID. So a particular user could have multiple documents, each of them storing the user ID and the dish ID, the user ID and the dish ID. So a collection of them together will define all the favorites for a particular user. I found that this is a better way of organizing this data in Firebase. In our MongoDB plus Mongoose, you saw that I had embedded an array of dish IDs into the favorites document and then defined the favorite schema that way. Here, I am using one separate document for tracking each of the favorites for each of the users. Now, because Firebase supports querying, so I can query my Firebase and extract all the documents that have the same user ID, which matches the user that is currently logged in, and then extract the corresponding dish IDs from the favorites. And then I will go and then query my server and then obtain the dish information for each of those dishes. So it involves multiple trips to the server in order to obtain all my favorite dishes information before I can render my list of favorites. But that is the best way that I could get Firebase to work with my Angular application. Maybe at a future date, Firebase Cloud Firestore might extend to allow something like populate that we did with Mongoose, in which case I would be updating the code to use that way of obtaining all the dish information automatically. So the burden of constructing this compound document will be shifted to the server side. Right now, my client is doing much of the work here. Now, when you go in here, you will see that in the get favorites method, you will see how I am accessing my favorites here. So when I do get favorites, I am querying this collection of favorites, but notice that here I say ref where user is this user ID. This user ID I obtain here. So in the constructor of my favorite server, I am subscribing to this auth service, the get auth state in the auth service. So in the auth service, if you go in, you will see this method called get auth state here. The get auth state returns the this.auth state, which I have defined right there. So this will be an observable, as you see me declaring here. So that observable is the one that I'm going to use within my favorite service and then subscribe to that. So anytime the user information changes, this will be automatically reflected in here. So you saw that even in the earlier application, I had used an observable in order to reflect the user information into my header component. Similar kind of approach that I'm using in my favorites component here to get hold of the user ID for the currently logged in user. So when I query my favorites collection, I will query and extract only those documents where the user matches this. And then I'm only using the value changes here. So I'm only extracting all the documents there. I don't care about the ID of that favorites document itself at this moment. So I'm just extracting all of them and using them. And if the user is not logged in, as you can see, I'm throwing an error here with the observable saying no user logged in. And that is what is displayed in my my favorites page there. Now the is favorites is also updated here, but in the is favorites, what I am doing is I'm going to the DB. Now here I will access the database by saying db is equal to firebase.firestore. Recall that I am importing Firebase here, import star as Firebase here. The Angular Firestore itself doesn't provide me with a method of doing multiple compound queries. Here, the Angular Firestore or the Angular Fire 2 doesn't provide me with doing that. So that is why I have to resort to using Firebase Firestore. So when I say Firebase Firestore, this gives me a reference to the Firestore database, and then I can go into this database and then say db collection favorites, and then I can do multiple queries here. So I'm saying dot where user is this, dot where dish is the dish ID. So if I want to obtain a specific favorite to check if a specific dish is the favorite of a user, I obtain that particular document where the user and the dish match these two. If they don't match, then it will be returned with an empty. So that I extract and then return this value here. Now when I post favorites, you see how I'm doing this. I'm saying this AFS collection favorites, and then I'll say add, and look at the document that I am storing in my favorites. The document itself contains the user ID and the dish ID. So these two pieces of information enclosed in here. And if not, then it will reject the promise with no user logged in here. And similarly for the delete favorite that I have implemented here. Spend some time again going through this code to understand how I have leveraged Firebase and Angular Fire 2 NPM modules in order to communicate with my Firebase server that I have set up in the previous exercise. With this, I have given you a quick overview of how you can set up your Angular application to interact with Firebase backend as a service, and then be able to support various operations that you have within your Angular application. And as I have demonstrated earlier, this Angular application works exactly like the previous version of the Angular application, where we were using our own version of our Express plus MongoDB server. Now, with this, I complete this particular exercise where I have illustrated in this lesson about backend as a service and also demonstrated Firebase as an example of a backend as a service.